Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. This is Hui Kai, Head of Content Division at WuXi AppTec. We are delighted that you have joined us today for the second session of our webinar series, Collaborations That Transform. We started this new series in May with the first webinar focusing on the rare disease, neurofibromatosis, to celebrate the first ever FDA approval for this disease. And today, I will continue the webinar series on another rare disease, hemophilia. You will hear from leading clinicians, drug developers, patients, and nonprofit foundations on the game-changing potential of technologies and how collaborations can change life for hemophilia patients. For the great support from our distinguished speakers today from the US and Europe, we deeply appreciate. We would also like to thank our collaborative partners for this webinar series, BioCentury, Children's Tumor Foundation, California Life Sciences Association, Informa, New England Hemophilia Association, and UK's Bioindustry Association. Thank you all. At WuXi AppTec, we share the common conviction that our industry must work closely together in order to bring transformative medicines faster to patients. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our first panel speaker, Dr. Glenn Pierce, VP of Medical at the World Federation of Hemophilia. Glenn is a distinguished drug developer himself. Over his over 30 years of industry career, Glenn was involved in the development of 5 approved drugs for hemophilia. He also served numerous scientific and medical groups, including advisory committees for the US FDA and Department of Health and Human Services. And last but not least, Glenn was born with severe hemophilia A and was cured in 2008. So Glenn, thank you very much for joining us today for the WuXi Rare Disease webinar on hemophilia. And so with your background as a drug developer, as a patient, a huge advocate, taking leadership role at the World Federation of Hemophilia, it took me great interest to see that the vision for the World Federation of Hemophilia is treatment for all. And so it's great to see this vision for the organization. At the same time, I noticed that by some sources that is widely quoted that 75% of the patients who has hemophilia actually do not have access to adequate treatment or even treatment at all. So can you share with us, how does this reality shed light on the kind of work you and the WFH is doing right now?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be involved in the WuXi seminar. I appreciate that. I think that it's safe to say that we live in a world of haves and have-nots. And what I mean by that is that if we look at North America, Europe, a number of other countries, they have access to state-of-the-art treatment for hemophilia. That includes recombinant and plasma-derived clotting factor concentrates. But that's only 15 to 30% of the world, depending upon where you do the economic cutoffs. The rest of the world, 70% or so, really has minimal access to therapy. They don't have access to much in the way of plasma-derived therapy, rarely have access to recombinant DNA-produced clotting factors, and so as a result have crippling, premature death, lots of morbidity and mortality associated with hemophilia. It's a very different life there than it is here. And that's really where the World Federation of Hemophilia attempts to tie it all together. How can we improve the situation for people in the developed world? But even more importantly, what can we do to accelerate the pace of advancement in the developing world, in less resource affluent countries?
Yes. So you mentioned definitely the access as one of the challenges. So is there any other challenges at the global level from your WFH perspective that you really see that is contributing to this? So essentially, what is the why after, the access issue? Can you highlight a couple for us?
Yeah, the access issue is big because if you don't have access, it means you don't learn as a healthcare professional how to treat hemophilia. And so that means that the management of the disease itself is handled differently in resource constrained countries compared to more resource rich countries. That in and of itself means that education is needed. We have a humanitarian aid program where at the World Federation of Hemophilia, we're treating 20,000 patients a year in about 60, 65 countries around the world, giving them access. And in conjunction with that treatment, we're also providing education, training, learning how to manage bleeding episodes more effectively, how to prevent some of the crippling that occurs with hemophilia, how to treat major bleeding episodes, how to do surgeries to correct joint damage that occurs in hemophilia. We can do all of that through the humanitarian aid program, but with that comes a lot of opportunity for training and teaching both the healthcare professionals as well as the people with hemophilia on how to manage their disease better.
I see, yes. So how big is the WFH, if you want to share with the audience here? I know you have many of the chapters. Can you give us a nutshell?
We do. We have 140 national member organizations around the world, and each of those is in a single country. And so of all of the countries in the world, we are in the majority. And we're in countries where we've been able to either ourselves or work with collaborators form a nucleus of a physician community and a patient community. And together, the two of those communities work to form an organization. Then they are able to find more patients, find more interested physicians in treating those patients. We help teach them advocacy skills to start to lobby the government to fund their treatment centers, to eventually fund some product purchase. And through all of that, that forms a good national member organization that will continue to further develop. And that's the swelling. That's the groundswell that we have within the global community, all working together to improve the lives of people with hemophilia and other bleeding disorders.
Yes, that's great. I know you're the vice president for medical for the organization. So tell us a little bit what your everyday work look like, and also what are the most important priorities for you?
Well, my everyday now is Zoom from morning to night with the World Federation of Hemophilia activities, as well as some of the biomedical research work that I do. Prior to that, though, it was a significant amount of travel to visit different countries, both in the developed and developing worlds, in order to assess the needs of individuals in both types of countries, as well as to provide training and education. The training and education not only includes treatment of hemophilia and bleeding disorders, better management of the disease, but also includes research, how to do epidemiological research, how to do case finding, how to identify patients who are in need and what those needs may be, how to do research that can get published and further the advancement of bleeding disorders in those particular countries. And then working with companies, working not only with the pharmaceutical companies that make plasma and recombinant derived clotting factors, but working with all of the next generation kinds of companies, the biotech companies that are pushing the boundaries on gene therapy and cell therapy and new ways of treating hemophilia that go beyond protein therapies. So all of that is encompassed in a day.
Wow, that's very exciting. I'm very much looking forward to your perspective at the next panel when you join the rest of the distinguished panelists. So to continue the kind of work you're doing, I'm pretty sure the collaboration is very important to the part of what you do. So from your perspective of being a drug hunter, a patient, and a patient advocate, how you see uniquely the collaboration will benefit hemophilia R&D as well as patient care? Is there any unique opportunities or challenges in association with hemophilia, or probably broadly speaking, rare diseases?
Well, sometimes I feel like I collaborate with myself, wearing all of those different hats. So
Sure.
how would I think about a particular problem as a patient, as an advocate, as a healthcare provider, as a drug hunter? And it helps to distill all of that and help me understand the multidimensional nature of a given problem. But more importantly, collaboration is everything for the World Federation of Hemophilia and our entire community. We couldn't do anything if we didn't collaborate. We have a lot of stakeholders involved, from governments to healthcare providers to industry to patients to reimbursement agencies that pay for these products. And so without all of us working together to find common languages to speak, I don't think we would make the kind of progress that we have made. The progress we've made as a community over the past 50 years is nothing short of miraculous. We have gone from no treatment back in 1960s to the kinds of treatments that we have today that are approaching and in some cases provide for 24/7 coverage for the missing clotting factor. So that's very exciting, but none of that could have been done without collaboration between all of these stakeholders. When I
Yes.
think about it, when I think about collaboration going forward, I think it's going to be key. In hemophilia, the work that we do in our community, I think, is a model for many other rare bleeding disorders. We have incredibly well organized communities where uniquely healthcare providers, patients, industry all come together frequently under one roof to discuss, collaborate, make advancements in the field. That's not as well organized in many other disease groups. Sometimes that's because they don't have as many patients as we have, but other times it's just because we've got this history of organization and we've had success in being able to move advancements forward as a collaborative unit, and that builds upon itself.
So, Glenn, how many drugs are being approved and marketed? It still can't really get me when I hear the number that 75 of the patients don't have access to adequate treatment or options. And at the same time, I believe we have quite a number of medicines being approved. Seems like the equitable access to medicines, that cliff or gap has been very big. Is that true?
We have had and continue to have a very large gap in equity between countries that have resources to pay a lot of money for these medicines and countries that don't have the resources to pay. Our humanitarian aid program treating those 20,000 patients is making a small dent, but it's a small dent compared to the number of patients in the developing world that need therapies and who otherwise get into big trouble, including death, without them. So we have a big disparity that we need to continue to work toward closing the gap on.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Glenn, for the sharing. So, we all know collaboration is so important. We actually also firsthand witnessed the kind of extraordinary collaborations we have done, especially today when the whole world is fighting against COVID-19. We have seen the outcomes, definitely great progress be made because of collaboration. Like we're talking about vaccine development, it used to be years and years, and now we're talking months. So I'm just curious, from your perspective and observation, the kind of collaborative efforts, innovative collaborative models that have been applying to COVID-19, do you see that might be able to shed some light on the future of the hemophilia R&D as well as the rare disease R&D?
Well, I actually think we're probably doing a better job in hemophilia than we are with COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
We have this massive global effort, as we all know, toward improving treatment so that patients who get COVID-19 have a higher chance of survival, but also to come up with a vaccine. And there are a number of collaborations internationally. As soon as a treatment looks like it might be of benefit, it gets published very quickly. Other groups jump on it and either prove or disprove that that treatment may be effective. So that's a unique situation that we have with COVID-19 that I don't think we've ever had before. On the vaccine front, there's collaboration applying money and resources to different vaccines. But in in another measure, there's not collaboration. There are so many individual approaches toward coming up with a vaccine. I think that's a good thing. We don't really know what's going to work better than something else. And so we don't want everybody working on the same thing. If everybody's working on 15 different vaccines, that increases our chances enormously of coming up with, I hope, one or two that are going to provide sufficient immunity to allow us to get out of our homes again.
Great, great. Thanks. We'd love to hear more about the collaborative approach, I think, in the next panel. So let me switch gear a little bit. I know you are a hemophilia patient, and you told me before that you were cured. It's remarkable, and we're so happy for you. And so can you share with us a little bit of your personal journey to the cure as you go through the whole process?
Well, my whole personal journey in dealing with my hemophilia is really dealing with the hand you've been dealt and the serendipity of going in one direction or another direction and looking for the best chances of success for myself and my condition. By the time I was 12, I had had no treatment to speak of, and I was confined to a wheelchair full time. With the advent of cryoprecipitate and clotting factor concentrates from plasma, I was able to get out of the wheelchair and do sufficient rehabilitation to be able to walk again on my own, which I have ever since. But that transformation into being able to manage the hemophilia better, it was always there, and there were always setbacks, even with the improved treatments that we got each decade. I serendipitously wound up getting cured of my hemophilia. I had end-stage hepatitis from hepatitis C, end-stage cirrhosis, and required a liver transplant about 12 years ago. That's not something that one would go into lightly, and certainly not something that one would do in order to cure their hemophilia, but you do it because your liver's no longer working. The nice byproduct of that is that the liver produces factor VIII and factor IX, and so if you have hemophilia A or B and get a liver transplant, you'll be cured of your hemophilia. And so that's a terrific byproduct. And it really was a transformative state of mind to go one day from just having to worry about my hemophilia 24/7. Is this joint pain bleeding? Is it not bleeding? Do I need to take treatment? Do I not need to take treatment? Can I do this activity? Can I not do this activity? To being unencumbered and free of all of that. I still have the joint pain. I still have end-stage joints that may have periodically needed some surgery, but I don't have to worry about bleeding anymore. And having that freedom is a state of mind that is a very difficult one to describe. That is the state of mind someone who has successful gene therapy will have and has had. And by successful gene therapy, I mean a sufficient level of factor IX that one is no longer dependent at all on clotting factor concentrates. No more bleeding. That would be my definition of successful gene therapy.
Great. Thank you. So actually, Glenn, in our audience today and later through our global streaming platform, we have many patients as well as the family members. I'm sure they will be very inspired by your stories. Is there anything you want to say to them since we are having this conversation on the patient journey as well as the treatment and cure?
Well, I think all of us as people affected by hemophilia need to work toward curing our disease. It's been our dream since being diagnosed for many of us. And how we get there is going to be a different journey for everyone. What we really need to focus on is how are we going to transform that kind of an event into the developing world. We need to identify routes for delivery of gene therapy. We need to develop payment mechanisms. We need to develop improved manufacturing technologies. And we need to develop perhaps improved gene therapies beyond generation 1 AAV vectors in order to be able to get to the world. Ultimately, that's where we have to go. But that constitutes the full management of hemophilia from start to finish, if we can achieve a cure for both hemophilia A and B, and then start working on the other bleeding disorders.
That's definitely the future we'll all look forward to. So in the beginning, we talked about a treatment for all. Now we're talking about cure, the dream of cure. For some, like you, the dream has already been realized. For many, there's still a long way to go. So do you see a day, actually a cure for all that can be realized? And if so, when would that be?
Well, I am an optimist on this. I do think that we have overcome many challenges now for gene therapy for hemophilia, but we still have a number of significant biological challenges to further overcome. And it's only after overcoming those, after making more technical advancements in gene therapy, that we're going to get to widespread use of gene therapy for the treatment of hemophilia. So when will that come? I don't have a crystal ball, but I think we should be, given the pace that we've had over the past 50 years, which has just been remarkable in terms of technological developments, we need to be looking at the next 10 to 20 years as a place where we're going to continue to see the evolution of technology committed toward better treatment and cure of hemophilia.
And Glenn, just want to share with you very quickly, at WuXi, our vision is every drug can be made, every disease can be treated. We're definitely looking forward to the day to come. So with that, I want to thank you very much, Glenn, for having a conversation with me and to really share the state of hemophilia treatment on the global level and our vision for the future. I'm sure you'll have more to talk about at the next session. So this will be a very natural segue. And for me to introduce Rich, our moderator for the next session. So with that, thank you very much, Glenn, for joining us today. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you everyone for joining us at in this latest WuXi AppTec webinar, Collaborations that Transform. Now, this morning's webinar is concerned with the quest for transformative medicines in treating hemophilia. It's a rare disease, as you all know, that affects about 400,000 patients globally. Joining me today are outstanding group of key opinion leaders, patients, and drug hunters. Federico Bengozzi, the Chief Scientific Officer of Factor Therapies, John Pasty, Professor of Hemostasis and Thrombosis, Barts in London School of Medicine and Dentistry, Queen Mary University of London, Richard Pizzillo, hemophiliac and Executive Director for the New England Association of New England Hemophilia Association. Glenn Pierce is Vice President of Medical World Federation of Hemophilia. Ruggiero Vivaldi, President and Chief Executive Officer of Sigilon Therapeutics, and Guy Young, Director of Hemostasis and Thrombosis, the Children's Hospital, Los Angeles, and Professor of Pediatrics at USC Keck School of Medicine. A full biography of the panelists can be found in registration forms. Let's talk first about the evolution of treatment options. So, John, how has the evolution? How has hemophilia treatment options evolved over time?
Immensely, I think, can be said in one word. Many years ago, treatment was really limited: bed rest, maybe plasma, maybe some whole blood. That would be in the 1950s and 60s, and that made hemophilia really difficult to live with, and people died very early because of it and ended up with terrible joints and terrible disabilities as a consequence of recurrent bleeding. The first big thing that came along was the development of factor concentrates derived from plasma, which transformed people's lives and gave them a freedom that they didn't have before. But that was hugely tainted by bloodborne viruses, HIV and latterly hepatitis C. We learned from that, developed safer plasma concentrates, but also invested heavily as a community in recombinant technology and developed recombinant factor 8 and 9 concentrates, which is essentially the backbone of what we have today. So for 20 odd plus years, that was the sort of the basic element of treatment. But in the last 10, 15 years, there's been a huge expansion of options. The first being bioengineered factor concentrates that have improved pharmacokinetics, longer half-lives, have to give them less frequently. You can get higher levels with them. And much more recently than that, the development of non-factor therapies. So things such as emicizumab, and there are a number of other ones in clinical trials, such as fitusiran, SERPIN-PC, anti-TFPI approaches. So these have the advantage of being given infrequently. They're not dependent on factor concentrates, and they can often be given subcutaneously. So we've seen a huge evolution over the years, and then we've got more evolution to see with these products being further studied, and also with the evolution of gene therapy, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in this session later.
Guy, this evolution shift in the treatment of the pediatric population, has there been a significant shift in treating the pediatric population?
Yes, so I would say to build on what John said, really the same applies to the pediatric population. But where there is one, I think, major difference, and this is something that we have available to us today that we did not have as recently as about 3 years ago. So emicizumab is a subcutaneously delivered therapy. Before we had that, everything was IV, which made treating the very youngest infants extraordinarily challenging, actually to the point of impossible. And therefore, the youngest infants were never put on any form of prophylaxis. What has happened recently is that we now have that ability. And I'll just give you an example from my clinical practice, literally from 1 week ago. We had a new baby who was born, was having some symptoms. It was born to a mother who was a carrier of hemophilia. And to make a long story short, he had bleeding around his brain. Of course, we did give him IV factor. We put an IV. However, that treatment would need to be ongoing for at least weeks, if not months, to treat the bleed and prevent recurrence of the bleed. So that would have meant inserting a type of central line that sticks out of the chest and the risk for infections. However, what I chose to do, and that could be debated whether it was the right thing or not, was to use emicizumab, because a subcutaneously delivered treatment can be done in the home and without a central line fairly easily. So that's what I did with that child. And that's an example of what doors have been opened with subcutaneous therapy that we didn't have before, that is sort of unique to the pediatric, and particularly the youngest pediatric patients. You know, for the rest of the pediatric patients, it is fairly similar to adult patients. They have the choice of the IV factor replacements, or we can use emicizumab in them. And certainly we have transitioned a lot of the patients to emicizumab. The last point on pediatrics is that inhibitors, which are the antibodies against factor VIII, they most often, if not entirely, develop in children, usually after 20 to 50 exposures of factor VIII. So that typically happens shortly after starting prophylaxis around the age of 1, 2, maybe 3. And while treating those patients with immune tolerance induction, I believe, is still important, something I actually just had a debate on, I would also say that emicizumab has made things a lot easier with respect to treating their bleeding. Of course, with the other new therapies that John mentioned, those are going to be coming as well, and those can be used subcutaneously too. So I think this revolution has definitely helped pediatric care as well, including with that unique segment of the youngest of infants, where we now have a prophylaxis option that is feasible and relatively easy compared to what we had before.
So this question is directed to Glenn. And what treatment would you consider to be most transformative for patients?
From a historical point of view, it would have to be the development of clotting factor concentrates in the 1960s. The protein purification technologies that were developed at that time allowed for the concentration of factor VIII and factor IX into a much more concentrated form that could, when infused into a patient, immediately stop the bleeding. I think that's probably the most transformative event in the modern era. In the more recent era, the development of a bispecific antibody that can actually replace some of the functions of factor VIII, I think was a Herculean feat that has proven to be very effective in the management of hemophilia.
To Federico, what would you consider to be most transformative for patients?
Well, I guess I'm here to represent the gene therapy side of the story, right? So, and I still believe that gene therapy can potentially deliver a truly transformative effect in terms of clinical outcomes in hemophilia by essentially limiting the treatment to one single therapeutic intervention, which then corrects the bleeding phenotype. And we're still writing the history of gene therapy for hemophilia as we speak, but I think some of the ongoing data that are developing in several trials are quite compelling. Showing.
And Rich, as a patient, what would you say has been most transformative for you?
Yeah, I would say what has been the most transformative is that patients have a choice. As Guy mentioned, inhibitor patients didn't really have a choice. They had a couple of options. And as we look right now, you not only have clotting factor, you have other non-factor replacement therapies that are working. So I would say that, the mix of not just clotting factor, but non-factor replacement therapies in the future is what is really, I guess, transformative for patients, because you have choices of what actually can work now and is actually showing really good outcomes for patients, whether they're hemophilia A, hemophilia B, et cetera.
And from a safety and efficacy standpoint, what are the current limitations of such therapies? And why don't we go to Virgilio for a discussion?
Yeah, I think that the greater advances have happened in hemophilia treatment. That is number one. Number two, I think that it's clear that the prophylaxis slows and prevents hemophilic arthropathy. What I see is still the limiting factors. I would probably summarize in 5. One is the non-ideal factor kinetics. Again, the peaks and troughs. And this has happened not only with hemophilia. For example, with lysosomal storage disease, we have peaks and troughs for the enzymes like we have for the factors. That is not what a normal person does. 2, the breakthrough bleeds, they lead to a chronic joint disease. And sometimes you don't need that much breakthrough bleeds to trigger that combination of joint disease. And that impacting quality of life, and also impacting the health resource utilization with a very high health resource utilization. And finally, I think that Guy and Glenn, you all put very well in terms of the benefits of the B-specific antibodies. We still have risks, and again, the question was on the risks. We did see some thrombotic events and also some interference in coagulation test with the neofactor, non-factor agents. And I call this unknowns that we still have. And also we have some knowns in terms of what we still have to see in terms of longer term follow-up, particularly related to the joint disease. So those are the categories, and I don't want to take too much more time, but those I think that is still something that everybody together here, patients, physicians, industries, we can work together to what is the solution that we still can bring to this patient community.
What's been very exciting developments in the area of hemophilia or the treatment of hemophilia is that of gene therapy. And so, we're really on the verge, I believe, of transformation with the recent clinical results that John's been involved with there. So, what were the limit? I mean, gene therapy has been around for a while, at least the origins of it. And so what were the limitations of the earlier versions of gene therapy that dates back probably about 2 decades, actually? And how are those solved with the current products? So let's start with Glenn, to talk about the gaps that the therapy addresses in treating hemophilia.
We've had a number of different efforts using different kinds of technologies to try to achieve gene therapy to replace the Factor VIII or the Factor IX gene and provide therapeutic levels. Most of those haven't worked, but they have all been iterative, getting us to this place. And at this point, a number of patients can be treated now with gene therapy, have been treated, and have achieved therapeutic levels of Factor VIII and Factor IX. So in one sense, we're making excellent progress. But in another sense, we still have a little ways to go before this can be considered a mainstream therapeutic. We have a tremendous amount of variability. It's not clear that every patient would be able to respond to gene therapy. And in fact, those patients who have antibodies to the vector used, AAV, will not be able to respond to gene therapy. And then there are some unknown safety issues that continue to be present, along with the durability question. For Factor IX, durability seems to be pretty stable out 8 years, at least in one trial. But for Factor VIII, at least in one trial, the durability seems to be decreasing as time goes on. And so these kinds of questions need to be resolved and need to be understood much more before gene therapy is going to be the major therapy for hemophilia. Yet the promise is there.
John, you've been very involved in this area as a principal investigator. What have been your findings?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, as you said and Glenn said, gene therapy has been something that people have been looking at for years, 25 years or more, and it was always 5 years around the corner. It may actually now be on the precipice. We're actually about to see it. So I think it is very exciting, but we do have to, bear in mind what we've had, the ups and downs. But I think Glenn's hit it on the head with those 4 points that we need to know for gene therapy for the future. The reliability of it working, something about understanding the variability of the level that you get, clearly knowing how long it's likely to last in you and how long you're going to get some form of clinical response that means something, and of course the safety. So I think that there is, what I've learned from being involved is that people with haemophilia are hugely excited about this. It's been a holy grail for years and years, and partly fueled by that 5 years around the corner all the time. But we've still got questions to answer. But I think those are the 4 key topics that we're all focusing on and working towards getting a much better understanding. At the end of the day, it's a treatment choice, and it's going to be about weighing up what you know versus what you don't know versus what you want as an individual. So I think those are probably the sort of what I've learned from being involved in this, aside from the obvious thing of seeing people's lives literally transformed by it, and being able to think way less about their haemophilia and much more about what they would like to do as individuals.
So, Guy, do you foresee gene therapy emerging as the first choice for pediatric hemophilia, given all the choices that are out there?
So that's the other limitation at this point, is that these treatments have only been tested in patients 18 years and older. And in my center, we do take care of children and adults. So I have also been involved in gene therapy trials, and still am involved in gene therapy trials. So I've seen, some of these important positive effects. And I would love to see that come down to children. I think probably the ultimate irony of gene therapy at this point is that the patients that stand to benefit the most are actually the youngest patients, because they haven't developed any bleeds, any joint disease. If you can treat a child, in the first year of life before they've developed any of the manifestations of hemophilia and bring their factor level, if not to the normal range, to a range where they will not have symptoms, then you can prevent lifelong damage to joints and prevent, the other issues of bleeding manifestations that occur. So I think at some point, we will need to look into that. But I think that's still quite a number of years away in terms of where having that commercially available for children. I think at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll at least start treating the oldest cohort of children, the later teenagers who are, let's say, 16, 17, who at this point aren't eligible. And so I think, once we get hemophilia, maybe not into the mainstream, but closer to that for adult patients, we will need to explore the use of gene therapy in pediatric patients. But it might be an altogether different endeavor than with the current platform that's being used.
So let's take a look at a couple questions from the audience. I'd just like to talk about access to all these different drugs. Do we foresee a single kind of opportunity where it's only going to be gene therapy, let's say, at the end of the day, or do you between call it the haves and have-not countries? Maybe I'll have Glenn touch upon that for a moment, because I could see a situation where the recombinant technologies might be more economical than the gene therapy in a have-not country. So, Glenn?
Well, the recombinant technologies aren't available in the so-called have-not countries either. And so what we have is the vast majority of the world has no access to therapy for hemophilia. And it's something that's just all too easy to ignore, but it's a problem that continues to persist. As new technologies get developed, they don't make their way into the developing world, into lower resource countries. That's an area that the World Federation of Hemophilia is very focused on. We have a large humanitarian aid program that is designed to not only supply Factor, but to train and educate on the use of Factor, both with healthcare professionals as well as patients. So at this point, we're treating 20,000 patients a year in over 60 countries, but that still is a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed out there.
So let's turn our attention back to patients. And Rich, what were some of the circumstances of your diagnosis, and what's been your treatment, and has it been a durable treatment?
Yeah, I would say that since I was diagnosed, being born in the early 80s, I've seen an array of different treatments that have been around. To echo what has been said, clotting factor has been transformative for many patients, infusing, especially when you could find a product where you don't have a lot of bleeds. I think that that's the key, where we didn't have options before, but if you just look at the clotting factor, extended half-life plasma and synthetic, that there are treatments where you're not actively bleeding. So I think it took a while switching to many products as an inhibitor patient who formed an inhibitor as an adult, having to go through an ordeal of living with an inhibitor for a number of years and not tolerizing. But I think for a patient to navigate this, it's working with their provider. Having a good relationship with your provider and your team is essential right now. This is long past the days of going to your clinic and nodding your head and just listening. We as patients need to come prepared in our tool belt with questions, need to know what's happening with treatment, and having a good relationship to have this conversation as, is my treatment working, and do some of these new treatments, could they potentially be used for my care, I think is the key message right now as patients are navigating so many of these new opportunities that are coming down the path line.
So, Rogerio, would you like to add into that, please?
For me, patient voice is key on really driving innovation. So while we as an industry, we are experts on drug development, patients are the experts on their journey, on their needs, on what they feel, what their condition. And so that is, for me, by truly listening them, and by caring deeply about their story, I think that we can put sense of urgency among the industry to go forward, to really work through the patient narrative, and to be able to work together to really potentially create a new therapy that address their fears. And if someone said that exactly this is to, okay, forget about the disease, think about your life. And so that is only so I really commend the organization of this webinar. You have industry, you have physicians, you have patients, and because only us together can have a better solution for that. So that I think its patient voice is center cornerstone of all of driving innovation.
So it's an excellent transition to John. So what do you worry about most with your patients in terms of the care that you want to give?
Yeah. Okay. So there are going to be lots of things that bother us. Fortunately, some of the things that were real anxieties many years ago aren't today because we've got such better treatments. But what we want to be able to do is ensure that people remain safe, that their bleeds are well managed, that if we've got them on regular treatment, prophylaxis to stop bleeding, that we actually achieve that. I think there's been a lot of anxiety about people developing inhibitors in adulthood, and that remains a concern, but that is fortunately not too common. So I think what we want, rather than a concern, is more a desire that people have the safest, most effective treatment that they can have, and that when we look forward to the next generation of treatments, that those are going to come in terms of safety as good as what we've got today. So we talk about efficacy and safety all the time with the next generation of treatments, but as treaters, we put safety up there as the number one. Haemophilia has had a real checkered history of safety issues, and so it is absolutely front and center of everything that we think about. So if we've got a safe treatment that is not going to come at a disadvantage and it's efficacious, then we're on to a winner.
And for Guy, would you like to comment on that too? What are you most worried about with your patients, the pediatric population?
Yeah, I think one of the unique things about the pediatric population is we go from, like the patient I saw yesterday, the 2-week-old who is entirely dependent on his parent for getting the right treatment and making proper decisions on their behalf. And then we go to the teenagers who we have significant issues with adherence, where we have fantastic treatments for them. We've discussed some of them. There are different options, as Rich pointed out, and we just need them to come in and have a discussion with us so we can make their choice together that they're satisfied with, and then that they actually give their treatment. So we go from, total dependence on a parent who, generally speaking, there is pretty good adherence, but not always, to teenagers who we have to rely on them to do their treatment, sometimes with parental support, but ultimately the teenager is the one who has to do it. So probably what I worry about most is, the adherence aspect, which really comes into play a lot in our pediatric age group, and it just changes constantly from as children grow and develop. And then the other thing that we always have to think about is the differing stages of life. So, there's the preschool age where, there are certain issues you're concerned about, and then different issues when kids start going to school. So now for the first time, they're away from their parents in school. And I can tell you that is a very anxiety-provoking situation for parents. And then into the teenage years where I mentioned often issues with adherence. So I think what I worry about when I think about pediatric patients is for them to get the full comprehensive support that they need throughout their childhood years into their teenage years so that they can benefit from the best treatments that we have for them.
So John, how does this mode of treatment evolve over time for any one patient? I mean, that actually, it sounds like it occurs from one mode to another mode, let's say.
Well, yes. I mean, we've been on a sort of recombinant concentrates for a while, and then we had the next generation of extended half-life concentrates, and now we've got obviously the bispecific antibodies to consider, for instance, and we will have other things in the future. So it's an ongoing, active discussion with our patients about what the opportunities are and what the different treatments offer. So from standard half-life to extended half-life, there's pretty much again, with minimal anxieties or concerns. The main issue there is that it's often more expensive. But as we swap to the non-factor replacement therapies and maybe gene therapy in the future, the discussions are going to be more complex and the choices are going to be more nuanced. But we do find that people move through a lifestyle program of changing treatments as they evolve, and people's needs individually change. What you might need in terms of how you manage your treatment in your 20s can be very different from what you might need when you've got young kids in your 30s, or you've got a busy job and career in your 40s compared to somebody who's retiring in their 60s. So lifestyle, life events change treatment needs as well. So this is not one treatment and you're on it forever. This is a treatment program that is trying to adapt to the new technologies that are coming down the line that give us the best opportunities and personalize them. So I think that's one of the words that we hear a lot of in haemophilia care: personalization and individualization of treatment. And I think that that's really important, because one single approach to treatment does absolutely not suit everybody. And you've got to think of the individual.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. I have a question from the audience, probably directed to Rich and Bess. And how has the role of the patient advocacy and support groups changed over time? Are they more engaged with R&D and regulatory agencies such as the FDA?
Yeah, I would say that over time, patient advocacy groups have played an instrumental role in many of the voices that have occurred. So I know that when the FDA had open panel discussions, NHF and HFA have played a major role in having patients represented. I think on a local level, from a chapter's perspective, having patients engage is crucial because, as Rogerio said, without the patient voice, a lot of these new technologies couldn't be developed. So making sure that patients are being heard and their concerns. And I think that's why it's important for patients to attend local events. Everyone loves coming to the events to grab the tchotchkes from the companies, but that's not why the companies are there. It's to engage in conversation, to understand what the technologies are, to then bring that back to their provider to have engaging conversations around that.
I'll have Glenn comment, because you work for a nonprofit organization. Then I'd like Rogerio to add into that. Glenn?
Well, patient advocates have developed a very strong international network in hemophilia. It got started in the 50s and 60s, but really took hold during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. That's when patients began becoming much more vocal, taking much more charge of their care in working collaboratively with their physicians, rather than in a more paternalistic or maternalistic kind of a fashion as predominated in American medicine in the first half of the century. So it's key, as Rich says. It's important that we take charge of our destiny, and the best way to do that is to learn and advocate on behalf of ourselves and others who have hemophilia and other bleeding disorders.
Rogerio, comment?
Yeah, the only thing that I will add is that I have worked with many chronic disease myself. I have type 1 diabetes for 46 years and over, and I never seen a community like hemophilia that really understand their role. And of course, all the past that Glenn has mentioned made me to gain a profound respect for that community. And as an industry, we have to consider this, going back to what John said about having safety as the number one thing. Are we sure about that? Because this community cannot suffer other obstacles that they had in the past. So again, I learned a lot over my past years working very close with the hemophilia community, and they are doing exactly what Glenn is saying. They participate, they interfere, and they drive, and we just need to learn from them as well. So it's a very, very, very enriched partnership that exists and should exist in all diseases. When you don't have that, this is where the development may take many, many more years than would be.
So Federico, what kind of technical challenges are you facing, or we might or what improvements we might expect out of gene therapy?
I think we touched upon the main challenges of gene therapy, right? And probably the ones that they're most discussed nowadays are the durability and the issue of immunity, in particular, for example, the pre-existing immunity against the gene therapy vectors that we're using, which really limits the use of the technology in broader patient population. So I think these are two important hurdles, which can be also interconnected, if you want, that we need to solve moving forward. Because, for example, durability, if it's true that gene therapy in some cases is not lasting forever, then you may want to envision in the future ways to re-administer the vectors that we currently use for gene therapy, and that has to go through essentially overcoming the immunization effect that we observe today in the participants to clinical trials. So you can either design strategies around that with the existing platform, or you can even envision that in the future for gene therapy there will be new platforms coming along that are better than the ones we use today. So more specifically, as is probably common knowledge, the gene therapy platform that is mostly used for hemophilia today is the adeno-associated viral vector platform, or AAV. And then we'll see what the future brings us in terms of new platforms.
So we're talking about platforms. Question directed to Rogerio is, how is the platform that you're developing being at Sigilon? How is that addressing issues relative to, call it standard of care or other near-term prospects?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I think that first of all, the potential and the aim is functional cure. And understanding that functional cure, we want to have a sustainable factor levels without the peaks and troughs that we discussed, without using viral vectors, and with that, avoiding all the challenges that derived from the utilization of those vectors, which allows a much broader patient eligibility because of the factors that Federico has rightly put there. And I think that would be very important, a more predictable factor levels, so that we can even think about patient in the way that John said about personalization. There are patients that are much more active than others. And so if we know a little bit more how to predict factor levels, we can even imagine in the future to have these more customized, to be redosable, to not need any immunosuppression or even use of steroids that could cause any complications in the future. And finally, the point that Glenn made about access. We are working at Sigilon with an scalable manufacturing process that can lead us to have much lower cost of goods, so that can facilitate worldwide access. And again, I am from Brazil, worked most of my life over there and worked in many considered rest of the world. I don't like that definition, but there are 40% of the patients with hemophilia today in the world without treatment. And I think that we should think about them and having something that has more flexibility for access. That could be a solution that we could really go to that, not only the prophylaxis, that 65%, but for those 40% of patients that actually have no choice. So that is the perspective that we have, and we are very happy that we will be soon entering clinical trials.
And that's based on the factor technologies. So I pose a question to Guy. What gets you excited about emerging technologies, particularly in the non-factor approaches?
Yes, well, I think that we have one bispecific antibody now on the market, which is emicizumab, and I think just like the evolution that we've seen in factor replacement therapy, as we discussed, there can be an evolution in bispecific antibodies, and there are several companies actually working on improved, if you will, versions of what we have currently available. In addition to that, I think that there are other technologies such as fitusiran, which John has been very much involved in, which I'm quite excited about as well. The problem with the bispecific antibodies we have now and the ones that are being developed is they're really only for hemophilia A. And we are leaving the hemophilia B patients behind, as has happened, quite honestly, repeatedly throughout hemophilia history. So fitusiran offers the option for having a subcutaneous once a month easily administered therapy for patients with hemophilia B. In particular, for hemophilia B patients with inhibitors, there are very few of those, but I can tell you I have several, and they really are the ones that are suffering the most of all the hemophilia categories. And we sometimes particularly forget about hemophilia B patients with inhibitors because they are quite rare. But having a drug like fitusiran as an option for them, which looks like it will be coming, will be very, very important. And then the list goes on. There are the anti-TFPI inhibitors, although we've seen some safety issues with two of the products now, which is making us a bit concerned. But I don't think that I think there will be continued clinical development there, and we'll have to see what happens. Somebody earlier mentioned the Serpin PC molecule. I think here, or maybe it was in my previous session. That looks like a very interesting molecule as well. Actually, I think John mentioned that earlier. So I think that there's continued to be other approaches or other mechanisms of action for non-factor therapies. And, I envision hopefully as soon as in 5 years, having 4 or 5 of these on the market where we can, again, pick and choose and individualize. I think there's been several statements about individualizing therapy to meet patients' needs. And depending on the mechanism of action, the properties of these different agents, how well they prevent bleeding for people who are active or for people who are not active, having lots of choices, which Rich mentioned earlier, is going to be a wonderful situation for patients and a complex but intellectually challenging situation for people like myself and John who are treating patients with hemophilia, but something that I relish.
So the question to Glenn then as a follow-up would be, do these become options then for the, let's say, the have-not countries, economically disadvantaged countries?
If you're born with hemophilia, where you are born is entirely dependent upon how well you live, your quality of life, and your longevity itself. And so that's the hugest variable, where you're born. And for patients in 70% of the world, 70% of the patients, they're not born in a place where they're going to get access to the kind of therapies that Guy has talked about in any foreseeable kind of a future. So we really have our work cut out for us. And it's yet another reason why the technology such as gene therapy, once it's more widely available, really becomes a truly viable option for patients around the world, because a once and done kind of a therapy, right, if we can maintain some type of a cost benefit there, will be the solution for patients who are not going to have access to the kinds of therapies that both John and Guy have been talking about.
Thank you. So let's go to the patient for a moment there. With all these options coming out, opportunities coming out for getting treatments, patients fast adopters of change.
Yeah, I think it depends where you're looking at in the country. If you look at the United States and the demographics, I think overall patients are not. If you looked at it, there will always be those that may jump to the new treatment. But I think for those that maybe have experienced the bad blood error, there's a trust issue. There's a level of identity. I think for so many of us, hemophilia is not just something that you have as a chronic condition. It's all we know. If you're on prophylaxis and you're infusing every other day or 1 day a week, it's like brushing your teeth, and then you're suddenly being told not to brush your teeth anymore. So there's a level of anxiety that comes with that, of like how to think about the future. So I think it's really exciting. We look at this as not a green light, not a red light, but a yellow light, which is excitement with caution and excitement with being an informed advocate as to how we move forward. I was personally told that gene therapy would hit by the time I hit 18, and I'm well past 18. But I think to some of the comments that were made here, it is exciting that we are talking about this again, and there's a real possibility that this is going to happen, not just in our lifetimes, but in the near future. And that's a big clap and an excitement for all those that have been working on this for decades.
And as we're approaching the end here, John, maybe you could talk about a little bit. Do we see a cure in sight? Are we still, off, and why? Why are we off?
Yeah, cure is a word that has got lots of different connotations. And so we have to be careful about what we mean by the word cure. I mean, if cure is to completely correct the haemophilia and get a normal level of the clotting factor forever and a day, then I think we are a bit off that at the moment. If cure actually means transforming people's lives, getting them off treatment so that they're not bleeding, and they might need the odd treatment here and there to if they get hurt, have an injury or need an operation, that's much more realistic. A phenotypic cure is perhaps what we would say. That's, I think, on the horizon, very much so. But so we need to just be careful about how we use the word cure and what it means. And it means different things to different people. But I think a transformative treatments coming down the line that can almost give people that absolute normality of life is something that we truly believe is in our grasp, I think, for the first time in forever.
Okay. We're pretty much close to the end. I'd just like to get some closing thoughts from the panel here. Start with John, actually, provide some closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think we're in an exceptionally exciting time. It's a bit hackneyed, a bit cliched to say that, but we went through a period where we had good treatment, but much was happening. The last 8 to 10 years, there's been an explosion of technology and opportunities for patients with haemophilia, and the future, I think, is increasingly bright. But we must just always remember that safety has got to be absolutely up there as number one.
Right. Guy, would you like to add into that?
Yeah, I think I'll just use somewhat different words, but I would say that there was a time where, for me as a treater, that taking care of hemophilia became almost boring, right? I mean, it was the same treatments for the same patients given in the same way because we didn't really have much options. We had just the factor replacement option. And, it was funny how the research was done then was we were really splitting hairs in terms of, maybe we can increase the dose. So let's do something every other day versus every 3 days. And let's measure the pharmacokinetics down to the finest little detail. And that's kind of how we were making decisions. It was really more about very nuanced, minor little changes that, maybe had some impact and often really didn't have much impact. But for me as a treater now, I think, as I said, I look forward to 5 years from now, maybe even less, or I'm going to have multiple options. I'll have a gene therapy option for some patients. I'll have various non-factor therapy options for other patients. And there will still be factor replacement. And there are those patients who may still prefer to be on factor replacement therapy. And I would fully respect and support that and discuss that as another option for them. So yeah, I'm looking forward to, well, what I already have is having some options and looking forward to having more, because for me as a physician taking care of these patients, it's much more fulfilling when I can provide them with a broad menu of options rather than, eating tuna fish every day. So I guess that's how I would summarize it.
Federico, some closing thoughts, please.
I think for hemophilia, when it comes to gene therapy, I'm extremely excited because I started my career in gene therapy about 20 years ago, and that was the time when we found a lot of the hurdles of the technology. And today, 20 years after, I think the technology is not perfect, but we see now that it can deliver really transformative results when it comes to clinical outcomes. And we see now data emerging from, for example, the early trials for hemophilia B, that we have efficacy 10 years after a single therapeutic intervention, which is incredible. So still work to be done, still some issues related to readministration, immunogenicity, but I think the results are very, very encouraging. So I am extremely excited about what gene therapy can offer for hemophilia and other diseases.
How about Ruggiero?
Yeah, so thanks for participating in this panel with so many brilliant people here. I think that what I want is that for the patients that to have less fears and more hope. And if more hope means more innovation, that is what we want. I'm glad to hear, as always, Glenn saying about I always talk about healthcare by zip code, and I hope that the zip code would not define the health for people, but the science progress and all of us together could define what the people will have in their future and not their zip code. So I hope that science also thinks about this when they are developing a new drug. So again, how scalable it is an important element from the beginning. But thank you for this opportunity today.
Oh, Glenn, we'll do a good transition to you, and then we'll get to Rich.
Okay, well, what I would say actually in response to Rich in talking about a cure in 5 years not happening is that I'm quite a bit older than you, Rich. And when I was born, my mother was told we'd have a cure in 5 years. And so a lot of 5-year increments have come and gone. But I actually think at this point, we are there. We have a number of patients who have essentially had functional cures. They no longer have to worry about carrying clotting factor concentrate with them. We still have a lot of problems, a lot of issues that need to get solved, but we are well on the road toward that eventual dream of a cure. And I am confident that it will happen.
So, Rich, you're the most important person here. You're as a patient. So, what's some of your closing thoughts?
Yeah, I want to echo what Guy said. I think the menu analogy is the perfect way to summarize what patients are seeing. You are going to have an a la carte menu of treatments that whether or not you're comfortable taking something, you want to wait a couple of years, you want more information. If you choose to stay on your current treatment and you're not having breakthrough bleeds, I think that's where we are becoming. I mean, I'm seeing even in my own family with my brother who has hemophilia, 2 very different products we're on. We're both happy. We're not bleeding. And I think that that's a complement to science of the evolution, because 20 years ago, that was not possible. So I think as we look forward, it's extremely exciting to think about what this community could look like next year, 5 years, 10 years from now. I think what's important is we need to adopt adapt to the science. The science can't adapt to us. We need to continue to form as patient advocates and as organizations to make sure that patients still have that information to go to their HTCs and to patient advocacy groups, that they can't just disappear with these new treatments that are on the horizon.
Well, thank you. So I'll just summarize, close out today's session. We've seen remarkable progress in the treatment of hemophilia, removing much of the liabilities posed by factor concentrates and frequent injections, amongst other issues. And it's very clear that gene therapy is going to be here to stay. It's complemented by other non-factor approaches as well. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Federico Bengozzi and John Passy and Rich Pizzillo and Glenn Pierce and Ruggiero and Guy Young for your time and dedication to the patients. And finally, I wish to thank all of our viewers of the webinar for your time and energy to be here today. We look forward to seeing you at the next Collaborations That Transform. Thank you very much.